Hello guys, Uncle Vasil here with yet another video about history. Today we're going to cover the history of how hitman became a profession. We're going to start with their ancient beginnings and eventually cover modern-day hitmen. I hope you guys enjoy. Assassination functioned as a deliberate instrument of power across the ancient world, emerging early because eliminating a rival was often quicker and more decisive than open conflict, especially in societies with unstable succession rules and intense competition among nobles, generals, and priestly elites. From Egypt, where rulers like Teti and Amenemhat I fell to palace conspiracies, to Greece, where killing a tyrant could be framed as a civic duty, targeted political violence became woven into statecraft. Rome elevated this pattern even further. Julius Caesar's death, the routine murder of emperors, and the Praetorian Guard's role as kingmakers reveal how normalized assassination became within imperial politics. In Persia and the broader Near East, court factions, eunuchs, and royal guards frequently shaped dynastic outcomes through covert eliminations, while broader purges prevented rival claimants from rising. Across these civilizations, specialized killers and politically motivated plots created a proto-assassin archetype, using targeted violence not only to remove individuals, but to send unmistakable messages to rivals and entire populations. Julius Caesar's assassination remains one of the most pivotal political killings of the ancient world because it reveals how elite coordination, moral reasoning, and contested power structures collided in Rome. Historical accounts describe Caesar being struck down on the Ides of March in 44 BC inside the Curia of Pompey, targeted by a large group of senators who believed they were acting to preserve republican ideals rather than seize authority. Figures like Brutus and Cassius justified the attack as a necessary stand against tyranny, drawing on long-standing philosophical arguments about civic duty and resistance to autocratic rule. Ancient narratives detail how the conspirators surrounded Caesar, created a diversion, and then launched a rapid, coordinated assault. The aftermath proved far more disruptive than the plotters intended. Instead of restoring the Republic, the killing plunged Rome into renewed civil war and ultimately accelerated the emergence of imperial rule under Augustus. In this way, Caesar's death became a classic example of political violence, producing the opposite of its intended effect, turning an act meant to defend an old order into the spark that ushered in a new one. Contract killing didn't emerge fully formed. It developed gradually as societies grew more intricate. Underground economies expanded, and criminal organizations became more organized and specialized. It evolved into a distinct category of violence. Once murder for hire shifted from rare, informal arrangements into a predictable, transactional service. As states became larger and black market networks widened, people increasingly turned to third parties to eliminate rivals, silence witnesses, or remove political obstacles, creating a deliberate divide between the person commissioning the act and the individual carrying it out. This separation, defined in modern terms as an illicit agreement involving payment, is what sets contract killing apart from personal revenge or ideologically driven assassination. Over time, criminal groups institutionalized the role. Syndicates, cartels, and gangs relied on designated enforcers or hitmen to carry out targeted killings tied to territorial disputes, extortion schemes, or intimidation efforts. The work became more professionalized as well, with killers selected for discretion, detachment, and the absence of personal ties to their targets. By the modern era, murder for hire had become a widespread global practice, deeply woven into the operations of organized crime. Ultimately, contract killing solidified as a distinct phenomenon when profit-driven violence became systematic, outsourced, and embedded within criminal economies rather than arising from personal motives. The gap between hitmen and assassins is far more pronounced than most people assume, and examining their roles reveals just how differently these two types of killers function, a contrast that becomes especially useful when building worlds, analyzing historical patterns, or shaping believable character archetypes. Both engage in intentional killing, but they operate within entirely different moral logics, economic systems, and narrative identities, and recognizing this divide clarifies how murder for hire developed and why certain figures stand out in history and storytelling. Hitmen work for financial reward, acting transactionally as clients select targets and the hitman completes the assignment for payment, while assassins act from conviction, tying their violence to political, ideological, religious, or moral beliefs, and viewing their targets as obstacles to a greater cause. Hitmen kill whoever they are hired to eliminate with no personal or ideological investment, whereas assassins choose targets based on principle, focusing on leaders, officials, or symbolic figures whose deaths they believe will advance a mission or message. Hitmen function within criminal markets, cartels, syndicates, gangs, or freelance networks, where killing is part of a broader illicit economy, while assassins belong to movements driven by ideology, such as political factions, revolutionary groups, or clandestine religious orders. Hitmen emphasize stealth, speed, and deniability, aiming to complete the job cleanly and disappear, whereas assassins often use dramatic or symbolic tactics intended to send a message, provoke unrest, or inspire followers. Hitmen maintain emotional distance, treating the work as a paid task with interchangeable targets, while assassins justify their actions through belief, seeing themselves as agents of justice, destiny, or necessary change. Understanding this divide sheds light on how murder for hire evolved into a specialized criminal service, why political assassinations reshape societies differently than criminal hits, how to craft believable characters in fiction or analysis, and how motives influence methods, risk levels, and organizational structures. The rise of syndicate enforcers represents a major turning point in the development of organized crime, emerging as early criminal groups shifted from loose, opportunistic crews into structured organizations that controlled entire underground markets. As these networks expanded, especially during disruptive economic eras like Prohibition, they required dependable figures to impose order, enforce internal rules, and safeguard profits, making enforcers essential to their operations. Syndicates, operating as systematic and profit-oriented enterprises, depended on these operatives to maintain discipline, collect debts, intimidate competitors, and keep illicit businesses running smoothly, especially as older traditions of smuggling, extortion, and black market trade evolved into more sophisticated criminal systems. In the United States, the growth of large cooperative networks, such as the National Crime Syndicate, during Prohibition intensified this need, as booming industries like bootlegging, gambling, and racketeering demanded trusted personnel capable of protecting territory, enforcing agreements, and eliminating threats. Enforcers became far more than hired muscle. They served as organizational instruments that upheld authority and ensured compliance across vast criminal enterprises. Over time, they became a defining feature of organized crime worldwide, bridging the gap between leadership and street-level operatives and enabling syndicates to function like covert corporations with their own governance structures, disciplinary mechanisms, and enforcement divisions, reflecting the broader trend that increasingly complex illicit markets inevitably require formalized enforcement roles. The professionalization of murder for hire represents the point at which contract killing moved from improvised, isolated arrangements to a structured criminal service with consistent expectations, defined roles, and repeatable methods, building on the idea of a premeditated, compensated agreement in which a third party is hired to eliminate a target and gradually transforming into a specialized function within organized crime. As underground markets expanded, murder for hire became more systematic, driven by the demand for dependable, deniable violence. Early killers for hire were often opportunistic, but syndicates and cartels increasingly selected individuals for their emotional detachment, anonymity, and ability to execute planned killings without personal motive, creating a sharper divide between the person ordering the act and the one carrying it out and lowering the risk for those commissioning the crime. Criminal organizations formalized the role further by relying on dedicated enforcers or sicarios who conducted targeted killings tied to turf conflicts, extortion schemes, or political intimidation, and these operatives were no longer random muscle, but individuals chosen, trained, and sometimes groomed for precision, discipline, and reliability. Over time, murder for hire became a recognizable service within illicit economies, used to remove business rivals, silence witnesses, or settle disputes in ways that protected organizational interests. By the modern era, contract killing had become a global phenomenon, with thousands of documented cases across many countries and a clear pattern of professionalized planning, methodical execution, and division of labor, evolving into a specialized niche within organized crime that functioned as a predictable, outsourced mechanism for violence, mirroring the efficiency and compartmentalization of legitimate industries. Infamous hitmen who are captured often end up becoming public figures because their arrests drag them out of secrecy and thrust them into public view, revealing the hidden world of contract killing and offering society a glimpse of people who were never supposed to be identified. Lists of well-known hitmen consistently point out that their notoriety exists only because they were apprehended. In this line of work, anonymity is standard and fame is an accident. Once their identities surface, their stories spread quickly. Some, like Richard Kuklinski, turn into subjects of documentaries and media fascination, while others, such as Charles Harrelson, attract attention due to surprising personal ties, including his connection to actor Woody Harrelson. Many of these individuals become infamous because their crimes were exceptionally violent or extensive, with some claiming extraordinarily high victim counts. Their arrests often expose the operational structure of organized crime, since hitmen usually work for syndicates, cartels, or gangs. As a result, captured hitmen unintentionally become public figures, not through talent or intent, but because their exposure turns them into emblematic representations of the criminal organizations they once served. Contemporary contract killing remains firmly bound to organized crime, a link that modern research highlights with absolute clarity, as global monitoring shows that today's contract killings are overwhelmingly deployed by criminal networks to safeguard their interests, suppress threats, and maintain internal control. A major international study documented at least 2,700 organized crime-related assassinations across more than 80 countries during 2019 to 2020, demonstrating just how extensive and systematic this form of violence has become, with these killings functioning not as random acts, but as calculated tactics meant to intimidate rivals, obstruct investigations, and enforce discipline within syndicates, cartels, and transnational trafficking groups. Organized crime organizations continue to rely on dedicated enforcers and hitmen to conduct targeted killings tied to turf disputes, extortion schemes, and political intimidation, and in some regions dominated by drug trafficking networks. These operatives are often young, inexperienced, and heavily armed, resulting in increasingly chaotic and public attacks, even as the underlying purpose remains the same: reinforcing leadership authority and removing barriers to profit. The persistence of modern contract killing stems from how seamlessly it fits into the operational logic of organized crime, offering deniability for leaders, outsourced violence for efficiency, and fear as a mechanism of governance, allowing criminal organizations to function like shadow corporations in which contract killing remains one of their most effective and unsettling management tools. That sums up, guys. Keep in mind that this video is purely educational in purpose and doesn't condone any violent acts. For more such content from Uncle Vasil, please like, share, and subscribe. I appreciate your efforts. Till next time.